He slammed the marriage license down on the table so hard the coffee cups rattled. "I'd rather brand myself with a hot iron than marry that woman," Cole Harrett said through his teeth. His father didn't even look up. "You'll marry Eleanor Voss by Friday, or you'll lose every acre of this ranch. That's the deal I made. That's the deal you'll honor." Cole stared at the name on that paper like it was a death sentence. Eleanor Voss, the town's old maid. The woman nobody wanted. He had no idea she was about to become the only thing he'd ever need. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and ride with me all the way to the end. Let's see how far this story travels. The morning Cole Harrett turned 34, he woke up to two things he hadn't asked for: a birthday and an ultimatum. He'd been out on the south pasture since before dawn, mending a section of fence that the cattle had pushed through for the third time that month. His hands were raw, his back was stiff, and the sun hadn't even cleared the ridge yet when he heard the hoofbeats coming fast behind him. It was Danny, the youngest ranch hand, riding like something was chasing him. "Mr. Harrett, your daddy's asking for you. Says it's urgent." Cole didn't put down his pliers. "Tell him I'm busy." "Sir, he said to tell you, he said if you don't come in the next 20 minutes, he'll start selling cattle this afternoon." Cole set down the pliers. His father, George Harrett, was sitting at the kitchen table when Cole walked in. 71 years old, thin as wire, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of the same red rock that made up their land. There was a lawyer Cole didn't recognize sitting across from him, a leather briefcase open on the table, papers spread out like a hand of cards. "Sit down, son," George said. "I'll stand." George looked at him with eyes that hadn't softened in 30 years. "Suit yourself. But what I'm about to tell you is going to take the weight out of your knees." Cole crossed his arms. "Then say it." George reached across the table and slid a folded document toward him. "The ranch is mortgaged, has been for 6 years. I borrowed against it when the drought took the herd in '89, and I never told you because I was ashamed and I was stupid, and I was hoping I could fix it before it became your problem." Cole stared at him. "How much?" "Enough that we can't pay it back. The bank wants to foreclose by the end of the month." The room went so quiet, Cole could hear the clock on the wall ticking. "There's one way out," the lawyer said, and his voice was the careful, measured kind that meant he'd said something like this before and watched people's faces fall. "Bernard Voss has agreed to purchase the debt from the bank and forgive it entirely on one condition." Cole already didn't like where this was going. "Bernard Voss," Cole said flatly. "Eleanor's father." "That's right." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Voss is willing to clear the debt, all of it, if you agree to marry his daughter before the end of the month." Cole didn't explode. He didn't throw a chair. He stood very still for about 10 seconds, which was somehow worse than any of those things. "Eleanor Voss," he said like he was making sure he'd heard the name right. "Yes, sir." "Eleanor Voss, who's never been married, who's 38 years old, who everyone in Harding County calls—" He stopped himself. "The old maid," his father said quietly. "Yes, I know what they call her." "Why?" Cole's voice dropped. "Why does Bernard Voss want this? His daughter could have any man with enough money. Why me?" George looked down at his hands. "Because Eleanor asked for you specifically." That landed like a stone in still water. "She asked for me. That's what Bernard told me." Cole laughed, and it was not a kind sound. "I have never had a real conversation with that woman in my life. I've said good morning to her maybe 3 times at the feed store. She barely looks at anybody. She's—" He pressed his fist against the table. "This doesn't make any sense." "It doesn't have to make sense," his father said. "It has to save this ranch." Cole walked out. Not because he was done, he just needed air. He stood on the porch for a long time, looking out at the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. He knew every hill of it. He'd worked it since he was 8 years old. His grandfather had broken the first ground. His father had built the house with his own hands. His mother, before she passed, used to say that the land had a heartbeat if you listened close enough. He pressed his boot against the porch rail and stared until his eyes hurt. Then he went back inside. "I want to talk to her first," he said, "before I sign anything." His father looked up slowly. "Cole, I'm not signing a piece of paper that ties my life to a woman I don't know without looking her in the eye first. That's my condition." He looked at the lawyer. "Can you arrange that?" The lawyer wrote something down. "I'll contact Mr. Voss." "Good." Cole picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "And tell Eleanor Voss that if she's going to ask a man to marry her, she ought to have the nerve to do it herself." The Voss property sat on the east side of Harding, behind a row of cottonwood trees, so old they'd been saplings when the town was founded. Bernard Voss had made his money in cattle and kept it in land, and his house showed it solid, well-kept, the kind of place that didn't need to brag, because it didn't have to. Cole rode up on horseback rather than taking the truck. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because arriving on horseback felt more honest, like he wasn't trying to be something he wasn't. Bernard Voss met him on the porch. 65, broad-shouldered, with white hair and a handshake that meant business. He didn't smile when Cole came up the steps. "Mr. Harrett." "Mr. Voss?" Cole held his gaze. "I appreciate you seeing me." "My daughter is inside. I'll tell you the same thing I told your father. This was Eleanor's idea, not mine. I thought it was—" Bernard paused. "Unusual. But I don't say no to my daughter often. What does she want with me exactly?" Bernard studied him for a moment. "Why don't you go ask her?" Eleanor Voss was standing at the window when Cole walked into the sitting room. She turned when she heard his boots on the floor. Cole had seen Eleanor around town his whole life. You couldn't live in Harding and not see Eleanor Voss. She was tall, quiet, moved through spaces without drawing attention. Brown hair pinned back. Practical clothes. She had a face that wasn't beautiful the way magazines said beautiful, but there was something in it, a steadiness that made you feel like she'd heard everything and decided most of it wasn't worth responding to. She didn't look nervous. That was the first thing he noticed. He'd walked in expecting awkwardness, maybe embarrassment, maybe the fluttery discomfort of a woman who'd overstepped. Instead, she just looked at him level and calm and said, "Thank you for coming, Mr. Harrett." "Cole," he said automatically. "Just Cole." She nodded once. "Cole." He waited for her to say something else. She didn't. "Look," he started. "I'm going to be straight with you. I don't understand what's happening here, and I'd rather be honest about that than pretend I do. So if you could help me understand—" "I know you don't want to marry me," she said. He blinked. "I know what people say about me," she continued. "I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. I'm not asking you to love me or to be something you're not." She paused. "I'm asking for something simpler than that." "Which is—" She looked at him for a moment before she answered. "A fair chance." Cole stared at her. "A fair chance. That's all." He turned his hat in his hands. "Eleanor, Miss Voss." "Eleanor is fine." "Eleanor." He pulled in a breath. "You know how this looks to people, right? An arranged marriage in 1902. Your neighbors are going to talk. My ranch hands are going to talk. Everyone between here and the county seat is going to have an opinion." "They already have opinions about me," she said. "That's not new." "What about you? Doesn't it bother you? Marrying a man who's sitting here telling you flat out that he doesn't understand why you picked him." Something moved across her face. Not hurt. It was quieter than that. Like she'd heard a question she'd already answered for herself a long time ago. "My mother used to say," she said slowly, "that the only marriages that last are the ones where both people decide to try." She met his eyes directly. "I'm deciding to try. I was hoping you might too." Cole didn't have an answer for that. He rode home slower than he'd ridden out. The light was going amber at the edges by the time he got back to the Harrett Ranch, and he unsaddled his horse in the quiet of the barn without lighting a lantern, just working by feel, and the last gray light through the gaps in the wood. His ranch hand. Rupert, 50 years old, known the family since Cole was a boy, was sitting on a hay bale when Cole came in. "Heard where you went," Rupert said. "News travels fast." "In Harding it does." Rupert paused. "You gonna do it?" Cole hung the bridle on its hook. "I don't know yet." "People are already saying things. Tommy Briggs at the feed store was telling anybody who'd listen that you'd been bought like a bull at auction." Cole's jaw tightened. "Tommy Briggs has never worked a full day in his life." "That's true. Still." Rupert picked at a piece of straw. "What's she like, Eleanor?" Cole thought about it for longer than he expected to. "Quiet," he finally said. "That's it. She looked at me like she'd already figured out everything about me and wasn't impressed, but wasn't disappointed either." He pulled off his gloves. It was unsettling. Rupert made a sound that might have been a laugh. "That doesn't sound like a bad quality in a wife." "Rupert." "Just saying." Cole signed the papers 3 days later. He didn't tell himself it was the right thing. He told himself it was the necessary thing, which was different, and at least it was honest. The wedding was small courthouse, a handful of witnesses. Bernard Voss standing beside his daughter with an expression Cole couldn't quite read. His father came moving slowly these days, and he gripped Cole's arm before they went in and said, "Thank you, son," in a voice that was not the voice of a man who gave thanks easily. Cole said nothing. Eleanor wore a blue dress the color of a clear November sky. She didn't carry flowers. She stood beside him at the justice of the peace and answered her vows in a clear, steady voice. And when they were pronounced husband and wife, she didn't try to kiss him, and he was grateful for that because he didn't know what he would have done. Afterward, in the wagon on the way to the Harrett Ranch, they didn't speak for the first mile. The land stretched out around them wide and gold-brown in the autumn afternoon, and Cole held the reins and stared ahead, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the horizon. Then she said quietly, "I'll try not to be in your way." Something about that hit him sideways. He couldn't have said why. "It's a big house," he said. "There's room." She nodded, and that was it. The first week was like living with a shadow that was careful not to touch anything. Eleanor woke before he did. By the time Cole came downstairs, there was coffee made, and the kitchen was clean, and she was already gone out to the garden she'd started by the south fence, or in the small room off the parlor where she kept her sewing, or somewhere he couldn't quite place. She cooked without being asked. She cleaned without being told. She asked for nothing. She was the most courteous person Cole had ever shared a roof with, and it was driving him slowly out of his mind. Because he couldn't find the angle. He'd grown up around people who wanted things land money, respect the upper hand. His father wanted control. His ranch hands wanted fair wages and a straight boss. The woman he'd almost married 3 years ago, Clara Denton, before she'd run off to Denver with a traveling merchant, had wanted someone to admire her. Eleanor didn't seem to want anything, or if she did, she kept it somewhere he couldn't see. The night that cracked it open came 11 days after the wedding. Cole couldn't sleep. He'd been lying awake for an hour running numbers in his head, the ranch finances, the repairs needed on the north barn, what they'd need to get through winter, when he heard it. Music. Soft, low, coming from somewhere in the house. He pulled on his boots and followed it downstairs through the dark hallway toward the parlor. The door was open. Eleanor was sitting at the old upright piano that had been his mother's, the one nobody had touched in years, and she was playing, not performing, not showing off, just playing like you breathe. Like she'd forgotten for a moment that there was a world outside the music and the dark. Cole stood in the doorway for a long time without saying anything. The piece she was playing was something he didn't know, not a hymn, not a folk song, something older and sadder and more complicated than anything that had ever come out of that piano in his memory. He didn't move until she finished. And then the silence that came after the last note was so complete that he felt like speaking would break something that couldn't be fixed. Eleanor lifted her hands from the keys. She hadn't turned around. She'd known he was there. "I'm sorry," she said. "I couldn't sleep either. I should have asked." "Don't apologize," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "What was that?" A pause. "Chopin." "I don't know Chopin. Most people don't around here." She said it without judgment, just fact. Cole came into the room and sat in the armchair by the window. She still hadn't turned to look at him. "Play something else," he said. She turned then. She looked at him across the dim room, and he couldn't read what was in her face in that light, but she looked surprised, like she'd been bracing for something other than that. She turned back to the piano, and she played. Cole sat in that armchair until past midnight listening. He didn't understand all of it. He didn't need to. Music didn't require understanding the way a business deal did or a fence line did. It required something else, something he didn't have a word for, and Eleanor played like she had an entire ocean of that something locked up inside her and no other way to let it out. When she finally stopped, the room was cool and the lamp was burning low. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." "Why me?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. "Because," she finally said, "you are the only man in this county who has never once looked at me like I was something to be pitied." Cole sat with that. "I look at you plenty," he said before he could stop himself. She made a sound, small, surprised, almost a laugh. "Good night, Cole," she said. "Good night." She left the room. He stayed in the armchair in the dark for a while, staring at the piano, at the keys she'd touched at the empty bench. Somewhere outside, a coyote called once and went quiet. And Cole Harrett, who'd slammed a marriage license on a table and called it a death sentence 9 days ago, sat in the dark and thought about a woman who played Chopin in the middle of the night and asked for nothing but a fair chance. He was beginning to suspect, just barely beginning, that he was the one who'd gotten the better end of this deal. And he had no idea yet how right he was. Cole didn't sleep that night. Not really. He dozed in the armchair until the lamp burned out, and then he sat in the dark, thinking about what Eleanor had said, turning the words over the way you'd turn a stone in your hand to check every side of it. "Because you are the only man in this county who has never once looked at me like I was something to be pitied." He'd been honest with himself about most things in his life. He wasn't a man who flinched from hard truths. But sitting in that dark parlor with the smell of the lamp still in the air and the sound of Chopin still somewhere in the back of his mind, Cole had to admit something that didn't sit easy. He hadn't looked at Eleanor with pity, because he hadn't really looked at Eleanor at all. Not really. Not the way you look at someone when you're trying to understand them. He'd seen her the way you see a piece of furniture registered, categorized, moved past. The quiet woman at the feed store. The one people talked about in that half-sorry, half-dismissive way. Old Maid. Poor thing. Never been chosen. He'd accepted that version of her without question because it was the version everyone handed him. And she'd known it. She'd known it about every man in Harding County, and she'd picked him anyway. And the reason she gave him was not that he'd seen her clearly. It was that he'd failed to see her badly enough to hurt her. That was a low bar, Cole thought, and somehow she'd made it sound almost like a compliment. He got up before first light and went out to work because that was the only thing he knew to do when his thoughts got too heavy for sitting still. Rupert found him in the north barn at 6 in the morning fixing a cracked axle on the grain wagon, and took one look at his face and didn't say a word about Eleanor. He just picked up a wrench and helped. They worked in silence for a while, which was one of the things Cole had always appreciated about Rupert. The man understood that some mornings weren't for talking, but Rupert had a limit. "You look like you fought something all night and lost," he finally said. "I'm fine." "You've got that look your daddy gets. The one where his jaw goes tight and his eyes go somewhere else." Cole set down his wrench. "Rupert, I'm just saying. Say something useful or say nothing." Rupert leaned against the wagon. "All right, useful. Danny came to me this morning before you were up. Said some of the men are talking About Mrs. Harriet. Cole looked up slowly. What kind of talking? The dumb kind. Boys being boys. Tommy Briggs was out here yesterday delivering that fencing wire you ordered, and he said some things to Danny about how you'd been, his words, saddled with the town's leftover. Rupert paused. Danny told him to mind his business, but I figured you ought to know. Cole was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he stood up, picked up his hat, and walked out of the barn. Where are you going? Rupert called. To order my fencing wire somewhere else. He didn't go straight to the feed store. He went to the house first. Eleanor was at the kitchen table when he came in writing something in a small notebook. She stopped when she heard the door, and he saw her hand go still on the page. The way a person goes still when they're not sure what's coming through the door at them. That stillness bothered him more than it had before. I need to ask you something, he said. She closed the notebook. All right. In town, before all this. He leaned against the door frame. Did people treat you poorly? She looked at him evenly. Define poorly. Don't do that. Don't make me go in circles. He kept his voice level. I heard something this morning about what people say, and I want to know if it's been going on a long time or just since I was 22, she said. Cole said nothing. That was when the first man my father introduced me to decided I was too quiet, or too plain, or too much something. And once the first one says no in a small town. She lifted one shoulder. The rest of them hear about it. And they say things. People in small towns say things about people who don't fit, Eleanor said. There was no bitterness in her voice. That was the part that got him. She said it the way you'd describe weather. I stopped being hurt by it a long time ago. I don't think you did, Cole said. Something flickered in her face. I think you got very good at not showing that it hurts, he said. That's different. The silence stretched between them. Eleanor looked down at the closed notebook and then back up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was something almost unguarded in her expression, like a door that had opened a crack and wasn't sure whether to open further or slam shut. What are you going to do? She asked quietly. About Tommy Briggs. Cole put his hat back on. Have a conversation with him. Cole, it's not about defending your honor, he said. I'm not that romantic. It's about the fact that this is my house and you're my wife, and in this county that means something. If a man disrespects you, he disrespects me. And I don't let that stand. Eleanor stared at him. He walked out before she could answer. The conversation with Tommy Briggs lasted approximately 4 minutes and involved Cole standing very close to him behind the feed store counter, speaking in the low, even tone that his ranch hands knew meant he was genuinely angry rather than just irritated. Cole didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He laid out very simply and very clearly what would happen to Tommy's business relationship with the Harriet Ranch if Tommy Briggs continued to run his mouth about Mrs. Cole Harriet. Tommy went red, then white, then nodded 4 times very fast. Cole walked out, got on his horse, and rode back to the ranch, feeling approximately nothing, which he recognized as the particular numbness that comes after you do something that needed doing. What he wasn't expecting when he got back was to find Eleanor standing at the gate talking to a woman he recognized as Ruth Caldwell, the pastor's wife, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, the undisputed center of Harding's social gravity. Ruth Caldwell had opinions about everything. She'd had opinions about Eleanor Voss for years. Cole slowed his horse. Ruth was speaking too quiet for him to hear from where he was, and Eleanor was listening with that particular stillness of hers. Then Eleanor said something short. Ruth blinked. Then Eleanor said something else equally short, and Ruth Caldwell's mouth pressed into a line and she turned and walked back down the road. Cole rode up. What was that about? She came to welcome me to the neighborhood, Eleanor said. And she mentioned that she'd been surprised by our marriage, that she hoped I hadn't put any pressure on the situation. Cole's hands tightened on the reins. She said that to your face. She said a lot of things to my face. Eleanor looked up at him with that level gaze. I told her that my husband and I understood each other perfectly, and that I appreciated her concern. That's all I needed to say. She paused. She'll still talk, but she'll be more careful about what she says to me directly. Cole looked down the road where Ruth Caldwell had disappeared. You're better at this than I am. At what? Managing people. Eleanor made that small sound again, the one that was almost a laugh. I've had more practice. That evening, for the first time, they ate dinner at the same table and talked. Not about important things. Cole asked about the garden she was putting in by the south fence, and she told him what she was planting and why. And he mentioned that the soil there ran shallow over a clay bed, and she'd need to build it up if she wanted root vegetables to take. She asked him how he'd known that, and he told her about the summer he was 12 and had tried to grow carrots in that exact spot, and pulled up a harvest of twisted, stunted little things his mother had laughed at until she cried. Eleanor smiled at that. A real smile, not polite, not careful, but genuine and warm, and gone quickly like sunlight through a cloud gap. Cole realized afterward that he'd been trying to make her smile. He wasn't sure when that had started. The twist came on a Thursday. Cole was in town at the land office when he ran into Franklin Hess, the bank manager who'd handled the mortgage before Bernard Voss stepped in. Hess was a thin, careful man, with small eyes that moved around a room like he was always calculating something. He shook Cole's hand and said, "Congratulations on the marriage. Your wife's family has been very generous." "They have," Cole said. "Of course Bernard Voss has his reasons." Hess smiled the way men smile when they know something you don't. "He's been trying to get that north pasture attached to his property line for 15 years. I imagine having his daughter married into the Harrett name makes certain conversations easier." Cole kept his face perfectly still. "What conversations?" Hess blinked as if realizing he'd said more than he intended. "Oh, just the general business of neighboring properties. Easements, access, that sort of thing." He cleared his throat. "Good day, Mr. Harrett." Cole watched him walk away. North pasture, the most valuable piece of the Harrett property. 200 acres of flat, well-watered land that his grandfather had claimed, and his father had fought 3 legal battles to keep. The piece every neighbor with ambition had wanted for 30 years. He rode home with something cold settling in his chest. He didn't go to Eleanor first. He went to his father. George Harrett was on the porch when Cole rode up, and he looked at Cole's face and sat up straighter in his chair, which was how Cole knew the old man had something to hide. "North pasture," Cole said. George said nothing. "Bernard Voss has been after it for 15 years. You took a loan you couldn't pay back. He buys the debt, and the price is his daughter marrying into this family." Cole stood at the porch steps and looked up at his father. "Tell me I'm wrong." George's jaw was tight. "It's not that simple." "Make it simple." "Bernard didn't ask for the land," George said. "He's never asked for it directly, but if this family and his family are joined—" He spread his hands. "Down the road, when decisions get made about what happens to this land, he'll have a voice at the table." Cole's voice went very quiet. "And Eleanor. What about her? Did she know? Was she part of this plan? Did her father use her as a transaction?" George looked away. "You'd have to ask Bernard." "I'm asking you." "I don't know," his father said. "I don't know what Bernard told her or didn't tell her. I only know that she asked for you. He told me that himself." Cole stood very still for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. "Son." "Not right now," Cole said. He didn't look back. "Not right now." He didn't go home. He rode to the ridge above the north pasture and sat on his horse and looked at the land for a while, the way you look at something you might be losing without knowing it. The question that kept turning in his mind was the one he couldn't answer from a ridge. Did Eleanor know? Had she come to him with her fair chance and her Chopin and her level gaze and her small almost laugh, knowing that her father was using the whole thing to work his way toward land he'd wanted for 15 years? Or had she been as kept in the dark as Cole? There was a difference. A difference that mattered more to him than the land which surprised him, because 3 weeks ago, the land would have been everything. He rode back to the house in the last of the light. Eleanor was in the kitchen when he came in. She turned when she heard his boots and looked at his face and went completely still. "What happened?" she asked. "I need you to tell me something," he said, "and I need you to be straight with me. I'm always straight with you. Did you know," he said carefully, "that your father has been trying to get his hands on the north pasture of this ranch for 15 years? The change that moved across Eleanor's face was not guilt. Cole had been watching for guilt, braced for it, ready to see the small collapse of someone caught. What he saw instead was something different, a kind of dawning cold understanding, like a woman who'd just had a puzzle piece fall into place and didn't like the picture it completed. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet but absolutely certain. "I did not know that." Cole watched her. "But I believe you," she said, "because it sounds exactly like something my father would do." She sat down at the kitchen table slowly, like the weight of it had just landed on her. "He told me the arrangement would help both families. He didn't say, he never said—" She pressed her hand flat on the table. "He used me." Her voice didn't break, but the flatness of it was somehow worse. "Eleanor, I asked for you," she said. "That part was real. That was mine. But he took what I asked for, and he built something around it that I didn't know about." She looked up at Cole, and her eyes were dry and fierce and furious. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Cole pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I believe you," he said. She blinked, like she hadn't expected it. "I watched your face," he said. "You didn't know." She looked down at the table. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet." He was quiet for a moment. "But I'll tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to blame you for what your father did. And I'm not going to let this—" He gestured between them vaguely, not sure what word to put on it. "Whatever this is, I'm not going to let his scheme poison it." Eleanor looked at him across the table in the lamplight, and he saw something move through her expression, something he couldn't fully name, deep and cautious and real. "Why not?" she asked softly. Cole thought about the armchair in the dark parlor, the Chopin, the way she'd said fair chance like those were the two most important words in the English language. "Because you didn't come to me with an agenda," he said. "You came to me with something honest. That deserves the same back." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up, moving through the cottonwoods at the edge of the property. Eleanor folded her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." "I think," she said very carefully, like she was measuring each word, "that you are a considerably better man than you let people think you are." Cole looked at her. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. But something in his chest, something that had been locked and bolted and pointed outward for longer than he could remember, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. And neither of them spoke again. But they sat at that table together in the lamplight for another half hour. Two people who'd been thrown into the same storm by other people's choices. And for the first time since the day he'd slammed that license on the table and called it a death sentence, Cole Harrett did not feel like he was alone in it. End of Part 2. Part 3. Lưu ý viết 2.500 đến 3.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện phá hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần 2 đạt điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh sửa lỗi, AI, kể theo ngôi thứ 3. Tăng độ kịch tính không viết lan mạn kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn, không nhảy sang mức document mới, 2 đến 3 phút. Cần có mini climax và đạt 10 đến 15 mini climax, mỗi phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút. Có một twist lớn sâu sắc, đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn tăng tính tự nhiên, cho phản ứng của các nhân vật thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh cho tôi. Show more 1335. Orchestrated seamless narrative continuation with dramatic pacing requirements. Orchestrated seamless narrative continuation with dramatic pacing requirements. Part 3. The next morning, Cole rode to the Voss property alone. He didn't tell Eleanor where he was going. He didn't need to. She was smart enough to figure it out. And when he came downstairs with his jaw set and his boots already on, she looked at him once and said nothing, which he was beginning to understand was her way of saying she trusted him to handle it. Bernard Voss was in his study when the housekeeper showed Cole in, sitting behind a desk that was built to make men feel small when they sat across from it. He looked up without surprise, which meant he'd been expecting this visit. That alone told Cole everything he needed to know about what kind of man he was dealing with. "Cole," Bernard said. "Sit down." "I'll stand." Cole had said those same words to his own father 3 weeks ago. It felt different now, less like stubbornness, and more like a decision. "You want to tell me about the North Pasture?" Bernard leaned back in his chair. He was a man who'd made a career of not flinching, and he didn't flinch now. Franklin Hess has a big mouth. Answer the question. It's not what you think. "I think," Cole said, "that you've been after that piece of land for 15 years. I think you saw my father's debt as an opportunity. And I think you put your own daughter in the middle of a land deal without telling her what she was part of." He kept his voice level. "Barely. Tell me which part of that I've got wrong." Bernard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The part where Eleanor didn't benefit." Cole stared at him. "My daughter is 38 years old," Bernard said, and for the first time something human moved across his face, something that wasn't calculation. "She has spent 16 years being talked about by people who don't know the first thing about her. 16 years watching smaller women with smaller minds get chosen and celebrated while she sat in this house and pretended it didn't eat her alive." He leaned forward. "I saw a way to solve 2 problems. The land is business. Eleanor's future is personal. I don't apologize for wanting both." "You didn't tell her," Cole said. "She wouldn't have agreed if I told her." "Because it was wrong." "Because she's proud," Bernard said sharply. "Too proud to accept help when it's offered straight, just like her mother was." The room went tight and still. "She deserved to know," Cole said. "She made a choice based on half the truth. That's not a choice, that's a setup." Bernard stood up. "And how is she my daughter? Since we're talking about what she deserves." Cole looked at him for a long moment. "She's angry. At you. You ought to expect that." Something shifted in Bernard's face just slightly, just enough to show that it landed. "The North Pasture," Cole said. "It stays Harriet land, now and after I'm gone. That's not a negotiation. If you want a relationship with your daughter going forward, you'll accept that, and you'll go to her and tell her the truth about what you did. All of it." He picked up his hat. "That's the only deal I'm offering." He walked out without waiting for an answer. Eleanor was in the garden when he got back, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up, working compost into the soil around the south fence the way he'd suggested. She'd built up the bed with extra soil. She'd listened to what he'd said about the clay layer and done something about it. He stood at the fence and watched her for a moment without speaking. She looked up. "How did it go?" "He knows where things stand." She sat back on her heels. "Did he explain himself?" "He tried." Cole leaned on the fence post. He loves you. He just loves you the way a man loves something he thinks needs fixing. Ellen looked down at the soil in her hands. He's been doing that my whole life. I know. He's not a bad man, she said. It sounded like something she'd said to herself many times, working out whether she believed it. No, Cole agreed. But he did a bad thing. She nodded slowly. Then she looked up at him with that direct gaze that he'd stopped finding unsettling and started finding something else. Something he didn't have a clean word for. Thank you for going. You're my wife, he said simply. She blinked. And then it was so quick he almost missed it. Her eyes went bright for just a second before she looked back down at the garden. Cole walked to the barn and told himself that did not just hit him somewhere important. He was not convincing. What happened next came from a direction Cole hadn't been watching. Rupert came to find him that afternoon wearing an expression Cole recognized, the one that meant bad news that had been getting worse the longer it sat. We've got a problem, Rupert said. Tommy Briggs. Cole set down what he was doing. I handled Tommy Briggs. You handled him personally, but he went and talked to Pete Alderman before you got to him, and Pete Alderman talked to half the ranchers at the Wednesday meeting. Rupert pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. There's a meeting Friday night at Caldwell's place, and the talk is that some of the ranchers want to bring a formal complaint to the county about the Harrett-Voss arrangement. Cole stared at him. A formal complaint about what we're married. That's legal. They're not complaining about the marriage. Rupert looked uncomfortable. They're complaining about Bernard Voss. Specifically, they're saying that Voss used his money to interfere with a debt that should have gone through proper foreclosure process. They're saying he bought influence, and they're saying... Rupert stopped. Say it. They're saying Eleanor was used as bait to trap you. The words sat in the air between them like something ugly. Cole picked up his hat. Who's leading this? Pete Alderman. And he's got Ruth Caldwell behind him, which means he's got half the church women and their husbands. Friday night. Friday night. Cole thought for a moment. Set up a meeting with our ranch hands for Thursday evening. All of them. I want everyone who works this land to hear what I have to say before that Friday meeting happens. Rupert raised an eyebrow. What are you going to say? I don't know yet, Cole said. But I'll figure it out by Thursday. He told Eleanor that night. He'd considered not telling her, and then immediately dismissed it, because keeping things from her to protect her was exactly what her father had done, and he refused to be that man. She listened without interrupting, which was a thing she did that he'd grown to rely on, that complete attentive quiet that made you feel like what you said mattered enough to hear properly. When he finished, she said, They're going to say terrible things about me at that meeting. Probably. And about you. Definitely. She was quiet for a moment. You don't have to go. Eleanor, I mean it. This is my problem as much as yours. More, maybe. If you go and you defend this marriage publicly, you're tying yourself to it in front of everyone in the county. You're making it real in a way that... She stopped. That's harder to walk back later. Cole looked at her. What makes you think I want to walk it back? She looked at the table. It's been 3 weeks. I'm aware of how long it's been. You signed a paper to save a ranch, she said quietly. That's what this started as. You don't owe me more than that. Eleanor. He waited until she looked up at him. Do you want this marriage? The question landed between them like something dropped from a height. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, Yes, just that. No qualification. No hedge. Then stop trying to give me an exit, he said. I'm not looking for one. Her throat moved. She looked back down at the table, and he saw her press her hand flat against the wood the way she did when she was steadying herself. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. The Thursday meeting with the ranch hands was short and direct, which was the only kind of meeting Cole knew how to run. He stood in the barn with 12 men and said plainly that he'd married Eleanor Voss of his own free will, that she was his wife and a member of this household, and that any man who had a problem with that was welcome to draw his wages and move on. Nobody moved. He also said that if he heard of any man on his payroll speaking disrespectfully about Mrs. Harrod in town, that conversation would happen a lot faster and a lot less pleasantly. Danny, the youngest hand, raised his hand like he was in school. "Mr. Harrod, for what it's worth, she fixed that broken board on the garden fence 2 days ago without anybody asking, and she brought coffee out to us during the morning break yesterday." He paused. "She's all right." A couple of the older men nodded. Cole looked at Danny for a moment. "Thank you, Danny." "Yes, sir." Cole dismissed them and went back to the house, and he told Eleanor what Danny had said, and she went so still and quiet that he thought he'd said the wrong thing, and then she turned away very quickly toward the stove, and he understood that it had hit her somewhere deep, and she didn't want him to see it. He let her have that. But he filed it away, the knowledge that this woman who seemed to need nothing was moved almost to tears by a 19-year-old ranch hand saying she was all right. Friday night arrived like a storm that had been visible on the horizon for days. Cole rode into town alone. Eleanor had offered to come. He'd said no, not because he wanted to shield her, but because he knew how that room would look at her, and he needed to be able to say what he needed to say without watching her absorb it. Pete Alderman had set the meeting at the Caldwell house, which sat at the center of town and could hold 40 people in its front rooms. When Cole walked in, there were closer to 50 ranchers, their wives, a few merchants, Ruth Caldwell stationed near the door, like a gatekeeper. The room went noticeably quieter when he came in. Pete Alderman was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a handshake like a vice grip, and opinions like a vice grip too. Once they closed on something, they didn't let go. He stood at the front of the room and nodded at Cole with the particular nod of a man who thinks he has the advantage. "Glad you came, Cole. Saves us the trouble of sending for you." "Happy to save you the trouble," Cole said. He found a wall to lean against and crossed his arms. "Say what you have to say." Alderman laid it out. The mortgage, Bernard Voss, the arrangement. He made it sound like a conspiracy, like Bernard Voss had engineered the whole thing to take control of the valley's land one marriage at a time. He used words like manipulation and interference and improper influence, and the room leaned in and nodded and murmured, and Cole stood at the wall and let him finish. Then Ruth Caldwell, because of course she couldn't help herself, said it. And that poor girl, used as a bargaining chip by her own father. At her age. It's shameful. Cole spoke before he knew he was going to. "Eleanor is not a poor girl." The room went quiet. "She's my wife," he said. "And I'd thank you to use her name and her title correctly when you're talking about her in my presence." Ruth Caldwell opened her mouth. "I'm not done," Cole said, and something in his voice closed her mouth again. He looked around the room. "Bernard Voss did something I didn't agree with. I've told him that directly. Eleanor didn't know about it. I've confirmed that myself. If you want to be angry at Bernard, that's between you and Bernard." He paused. "But this meeting right now is not about Bernard Voss. It's about my wife. And I need every person in this room to understand something." He let the silence sit for a moment. "Eleanor Voss Harrod is the most capable, most honest, most composed person I have met in my 34 years on this earth. She came into a situation that was stacked against her, and she handled it with more dignity than anyone in this room has shown her in 16 years. His voice stayed level. "She doesn't need your sympathy. She never did. What she needed was to be treated like a person instead of a problem. And since that's apparently too much to ask of some of you," he pushed off the wall, "at least have the decency to keep your pity to yourselves." He looked at Pete Alderman. "If you want to bring a legal complaint about Bernard Voss, that's your right, but you'll do it without using Eleanor's name as ammunition. Are we clear?" Alderman's jaw worked. "Cole, I'm trying to look out for you. I don't need looking after. Neither does she." Cole picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it. "We're done here." He walked out. The room behind him stayed quiet for a long time. Tja, he was halfway home when he heard hoofbeats coming up fast behind him, and he turned to find Danny riding hard to catch him. "Mr. Harrod." Danny pulled up a little breathless. "You need to go back to the ranch." Cole's chest tightened. "Why?" "Your father. Rupert said he collapsed about an hour ago. Doc Haley is there." Cole spurred his horse before Danny finished the sentence. George Harrod was conscious when Cole got there, which was the first mercy. He was lying in his bed looking smaller than Cole had ever seen him, his color wrong, his breathing shallow. Doc Haley was a compact woman in her 40s, who gave Cole one direct look when he came through the door. "His heart," she said. "It's been giving him trouble for a while. Did he tell you that—" Cole stared at his father. "No, he did not tell me that." George coughed weakly. "Didn't want to be a burden." "You—" Cole stopped. He pulled a chair up to the bed and sat down, and gripped his father's hand, and it was the first time he'd touched the old man in something that wasn't a handshake in longer than he could remember. "You stubborn, impossible old man." George actually smiled at that. It was a ghost of his old grin. "That's where you got it from." Doc Haley gave her instructions: rest, no riding, no stress, come see her in a week, and left them alone. Cole sat with his father in the quiet. "I heard about the meeting tonight," George said. "Rupert talks too much. He said you defended Eleanor." "She's my wife." George turned his head to look at him. "Cole, don't." "I'm going to," George said. "I need to say this." He took a slow breath. "I made a mess of things. The debt. Voss. All of it. I put you in a corner, and I told myself it was for the ranch, but it was because I was scared and ashamed, and too proud to ask you for help." He looked at the ceiling. "You deserved better than what I handed you." Cole was quiet. "Is she good to you?" George asked. "Eleanor." Cole thought about the piano, the garden, the coffee she'd brought out to the hands without being asked, the way she'd said yes across the kitchen table without a single hedge or condition. "Yeah," he said. "She's good to me." "Good," George said, and then very quietly, "Your mother would have liked her." Cole's throat tightened. He sat with his father until the old man fell asleep, and then he walked out into the dark hallway and found Eleanor standing there. She'd come in sometime in the last hour quietly without announcement, and she'd stayed. "He's sleeping," Cole said. "I know, I looked in on him." She paused. "I made soup. It's on the stove when he wakes up." Cole looked at her in the dim hallway. "Eleanor," he said. "You don't have to say anything," she said quickly. "I know I don't have to." He took a step toward her. "I want to." He stopped close enough that he could see her expression clearly, and he said, "I don't know exactly what this is yet, what we are, but I know it's more than what I walked into that courthouse thinking it was." She looked up at him without blinking. "I just need you to know," he said, "that I see you. Not the version of you this town made up. You." He let that sit. "I see you." Eleanor pressed her lips together for a moment. Her eyes were bright. "Cole," she said barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I see you too." They stood in the hallway in the dark, close but not touching, and something passed between them that didn't have a name yet but was unmistakably real. The kind of real that doesn't come from grand gestures or perfect moments, but from two people deciding quietly and without ceremony that they are on the same side. From somewhere down the hall, George Harrod's breathing was slow and even. And outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the land breathed, and somewhere in the steady dark of a November night in Harding County, a marriage that had started as a transaction became something else entirely. Neither of them knew yet how much it was about to be tested. George Harrod spent the next 2 weeks in bed, and in those 2 weeks, Eleanor Voss Harrod became something none of them had planned for. She became the center of the house. Not in a loud way, not in a way that announced itself, She just filled the spaces that had been empty for years without anyone noticing how empty they were. She managed George's meals and his medications with the same quiet precision she brought to everything. And she sat with him in the afternoons and actually talked to him. Not the careful surface-level talking people do around the sick, but real conversation, the kind that required both people to show up honestly. Cole heard them sometimes passing the door. His father's voice stronger than it had any right to be. Eleanor's lower steady, occasionally punctuated by George's laugh, a sound Cole hadn't heard from that room in years. One evening, Cole stopped outside the door and listened without meaning to. George was saying, "I never understood why she stayed quiet. Your mother. She was the smartest person in any room she walked into, and she let people talk around her and over her, and I never asked her if it bothered her until it was too late to matter." And Eleanor said, "It bothers you that you didn't ask. Every day." A pause. "She knew," Eleanor said quietly. "Women like that we know. We just decide which battles are worth the energy. Staying quiet isn't always defeat. Sometimes it's strategy." Another pause. Then George said, "You're going to be good for him." "I'm going to try. He's stubborn. I'm aware. He doesn't know how to accept things, care, tenderness. It makes him uncomfortable. His whole life I taught him that softness was weakness, and then I watched him tie himself in knots trying to be hard and—" George's voice roughened. "I did that. That's on me." "He's learning," Eleanor said. Cole walked away from the door before he heard any more. He went to the barn and saddled a horse he didn't need to ride, and stood with his forehead against the animal's neck, and breathed until the tightness in his chest loosened enough to function. His father had just described him to his wife with more accuracy than Cole could have managed himself. And Eleanor had said he's learning, like she meant it, like she'd already decided it was true. He didn't know what to do with any of that except ride. The trouble that arrived that Saturday came in the shape of a woman Cole hadn't thought about in 3 years. Clara Denton, or Clara Webb, as she was now pulled up to the Harrod Ranch in a buggy that was too fine for country roads, wearing a dress that was too fine for Harding County with the particular composure of a woman who has rehearsed her entrance. Cole was mending tack on the porch when she came up the path. He saw her, and his hands went still. "Cole," she said, smiling the way she'd always smiled, like she expected it to fix whatever was wrong. "Clara," he said. Nothing more. She stopped at the porch steps. "I heard you got married. News travels. I wanted to come congratulate you. You rode an hour out from wherever you're staying to congratulate me. And to see you," she said. She tilted her head slightly. "I've thought about you." Cole set down the tack and looked at her directly. "Clara, what do you actually want?" She laughed, the light practiced laugh that used to make him feel like he'd said something charming. Now it just sounded like work. "I missed you. Is that so impossible to believe?" "You left," he said, "with a merchant, to Denver, 3 years ago. And you're back now wearing a ring that isn't from him." He held her gaze. "So however this conversation was supposed to go, let's skip to the honest part." Clara's smile thinned slightly. "Webb and I parted ways. I'm back in Harding for a while, staying with my cousin." She looked up at him. "I heard about your father's debt, about the arrangement with the Voss family. I heard—" She paused. "I heard it wasn't your choice." "You heard wrong, Cole." "I chose this," he said. "Every part of it. And I'd make the same choice again." Clara studied him. "You've changed." "People do." She glanced at the house. "Is she home?" Cole stood up. "I think you've said what you came to say, Clara, and I've said what I need to say. Safe ride back to town." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw it then what was underneath the composed arrival and the rehearsed smile. She wasn't cruel, she wasn't scheming. She was a woman who'd made a bad choice 3 years ago and hadn't found her way back from it, and she'd come here on a long shot, hoping something might still be salvageable, and it wasn't, and she knew it now. "She's lucky," Clara said quietly. no performance in it. "I think it's the other way around," Cole said. And he meant it. Clara nodded once, turned, and walked back to her buggy without looking back. Cole watched her go. Then he turned. Eleanor was standing in the doorway. He didn't know how long she'd been there. Long enough from the look on her face, not wounded, not angry, just watching him with those level eyes. "She's pretty," Eleanor said. "She's someone I used to know," Cole said. He walked toward the door, toward her. "There's a difference." Eleanor stepped back to let him through, and as he passed her close enough that their arms nearly touched, she said very quietly, "Thank you." He stopped. "For what?" "For not making me wonder," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something he hadn't planned to do. He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face just for a second. Just a brief, steady touch, and she went completely still, like a held breath. "You should never have to wonder," he said. He went inside. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a little while after that, and if her hand came up to her cheek where his hand had been, there was nobody watching to see it. The real storm broke 4 days later, and it came from a direction none of them had seen coming. A letter arrived from a lawyer in Amarillo, not the one his father had used, a different one representing a firm Cole didn't recognize. He read it at the kitchen table, while Eleanor was upstairs with George, and by the time he reached the end of the second page, his jaw was tight enough to ache. The letter claimed that George Harriet's original mortgage had contained a clause, a rarely used legal provision, that allowed the lending institution to contest the private purchase of that debt under certain circumstances. The bank apparently had sold the debt to Bernard Voss without properly observing that clause, which meant the transaction might not be fully legal, which meant the debt might technically still be the bank's problem, which meant the foreclosure might still be a possibility, which meant the entire arrangement, the deal, the marriage, all of it might be built on a legal foundation with a crack running through the middle of it. Cole sat with the letter for a long time. Then he went to find Eleanor. She was coming down the stairs when he reached the bottom, wiping her hands on a cloth, her hair slightly loose from its pins, the way it got in the afternoons. She looked at his face and stopped on the third step. "What is it?" He handed her the letter. She read it. She read it again. She looked up. "Does my father know about this?" she asked. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." Cole. She came down the last 3 steps and stood in front of him. "If the bank can reinstate the foreclosure, then we figure out another way." "There may not be another way." "There's always another way," he said. "I've been running this ranch since I was 19 years old. I've dealt with drought and disease and cattle prices that went through the floor, and fence lines that never stayed where I put them. I will figure this out." "But what if—" "Eleanor." He waited. "Do you trust me?" She looked at him, that full, direct look that she gave things she was taking seriously. "Yes," she said. "I do." "Then let me work the problem." He took the letter back. "I need to talk to Bernard before I talk to any lawyers. I need to know if he knew about this clause when he bought the debt. And if he did—" Cole's expression answered that before his words did. "Then we're having a very different conversation than the one we had before." Bernard Voss didn't look surprised when Cole showed up. He looked tired, which was different. The study felt smaller than it had the first time Cole had stood in it, and Bernard looked smaller too, not physically, but in some essential way, like something had been leaking out of him since Cole's last visit. Cole put the letter on the desk without preamble. "Did you know?" Bernard read it. His expression didn't change enough to be useful. "Did you know," Cole repeated slower, "that there was a clause in that mortgage that could compromise your purchase?" "I was aware," Bernard said, "that there were potential complications." The temperature in the room dropped approximately 10 degrees. "You were aware," Cole said, "that the whole deal might not hold up, and you went ahead with it anyway." "I believed it would hold." "That's not the same as knowing." Cole leaned forward, with both hands on the desk. You told my father the debt was cleared. You told Eleanor she was entering a marriage on solid ground, and you knew the whole time that it might fall apart under legal examination. Bernard met his eyes. I was protecting my daughter. You were gambling with her, Cole said. That's what you keep calling protection, but it's gambling. You gambled on a legal clause. You gambled on my father's desperation. You gambled on Eleanor's feelings for a man she barely knew. He straightened. And you didn't tell anybody they were sitting at that table. It would have held, Bernard said, and there was the first crack in his composure, a note of something that might have been genuine distress. If that bank manager had kept his mouth shut, if Hess hadn't started talking. So your plan required everyone to stay ignorant. Bernard had no answer for that. I'm going to fix this legally, Cole said. On my own terms, without your money and without your schemes. And when it's fixed, you're going to come to my house and you're going to sit across from your daughter and tell her everything. Not my version, not your lawyer's version, yours. He looked at the older man until Bernard looked away. She deserves the truth from your own mouth, all of it. Cole walked to the door. Cole. Bernard's voice stopped him. It was rough around the edges, in a way it hadn't been before. Do you love her? Cole turned back. He looked at Bernard Voss, a man who'd maneuvered and manipulated his way into a corner in the name of caring for his daughter, and who was sitting alone in his study, now paying the price for it, and who loved Eleanor enough to ask the question, even knowing the answer might hurt him. I'm getting there, Cole said. Fast. He left. The next 6 days were the hardest work Cole had done in years, and it had nothing to do with cattle. He rode to Amarillo twice, met with 3 different lawyers, spent a full day at the county records office going through mortgage documents that were older than he was, and spent the evenings at the kitchen table with papers spread from one end to the other, while Eleanor brought him coffee, and occasionally, without being asked, pointed out things he'd missed. The first time she did it, he'd looked up in surprise. She'd been reading over his shoulder, and she said almost apologetically, My father kept his books open when I was a girl. I learned to read land records before I could read a novel. After that, he stopped being surprised. He started handing her documents when he got tired, because her eyes were fresher and she caught things. They worked until midnight, 3 nights in a row. By the 4th night, Rupert came in to see how it was going, and found them at the table with papers between them, and 2 cold cups of coffee, and the lamp burning low, deep in an argument about a particular legal interpretation. And Rupert stood in the doorway for a moment watching them, and then backed out quietly, without saying a word. He told Danny the next morning, Those 2 are going to be fine. Danny had been of that opinion since the coffee and the fence board. He just nodded. On the 7th day, Cole found it. The clause the Amarillo lawyers had flagged was real, but when he dug far enough back into the original mortgage documentation, he found a secondary provision that his grandfather had negotiated in 1871. A rider attached to the original land deed that placed specific restrictions on how the property could be foreclosed upon in the case of debt transfer. It wasn't a simple thing to read. It was buried in language that required a lawyer with patience and good eyes. But it was there, and if it held, and his new lawyer in Amarillo believed it would, the bank's attempt to contest Bernard Voss's purchase of the debt would fail. The Harriet Ranch was safe, had always been safe if anyone had dug deep enough to find it. Cole sat in the Amarillo lawyer's office and let out a long, slow breath, and felt the weight that had been sitting on his shoulders for the past month lift about 3 inches. You're sure, he said. As sure as law gets, the lawyer said. Your grandfather was a careful man. Cole thought about the land his grandfather had broken the ridges he'd named the water rights he'd argued for in court twice before Cole was born. He'd been told that story his whole life. He'd never thought much about it except as family history. Now he thought that careful old man just saved us. 60 years after the fact, still saving us. He thanked the lawyer and stepped outside and stood on the Amarillo street in the cold November air and thought about home, not the land, not the mortgage, not the balance sheets. Eleanor at the kitchen table with his papers. Eleanor's voice low and sure saying, I think this clause refers to the original title, not the writer. Eleanor awake at midnight because somewhere in the last month she had decided that his problems were her problems too. He was on the road back to Harding before he'd consciously decided to leave. He came through the door that evening, and Eleanor was at the piano she played most evenings now, and he'd gotten used to the sound of it, the way you get used to the sound of the wind, something that told you the world was right. She stopped when she heard him. "Cole?" She turned on the bench. "What happened?" "We're all right," he said. "The ranch is clear. The legal challenge won't hold. I'll have the paperwork in hand by next week." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were steady, but he could see the relief in them. "Bernard, I'll call on him tomorrow. He needs to know he didn't have to do any of this. The rider my grandfather put on the deed would have protected us regardless." He set his hat on the table. He created this whole mess trying to solve a problem that wasn't as dire as he thought it was. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He's going to feel foolish." "He should feel foolish," Cole said without heat. "But I told him he needs to come talk to you. I meant it." She looked at her hands. "I know. Are you ready for that?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she ever thought about anything. "I don't know," she said, "but I'll do it anyway." Cole nodded. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the piano bench, not at the far end, not with careful space between them, but close the way people sit when they've stopped pretending the distance between them means something. She looked at him, surprised by the proximity. "Play something," he said. "Cole, it's been a long day." "I know. Play something anyway." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned to the piano. She played something he'd never heard before, slower than the Chopin Quieter. Something that moved like water finding its way around stones. He sat beside her and didn't speak, and let the music do what music did, which was say the things that didn't have words yet. Halfway through, without thinking about it, he put his arm along the back of the bench behind her. She didn't pull away. She didn't lean in either, not yet, but she didn't pull away. And her playing didn't falter, didn't hesitate, didn't change. Cole sat in the lamplight with the music moving through the room and his arm behind the woman who had walked into his courtroom and his kitchen and his late nights and his arguments, and somewhere in the process had walked into a place considerably more central than any of those. He thought about what he'd told Bernard Voss. "I'm getting there." Fast. He was there. He just hadn't figured out yet how to say it out loud. The music moved. The lamp burned. Outside the window, the cold November stars were out in their millions, indifferent and brilliant, the way they'd been over this land for every generation that had worked it and loved it and fought for it. And somewhere in the Harrod house upstairs, George Harrod lay in his bed listening to the piano and smiled in the dark. He'd heard that music before. His wife had played it, the same slow, careful piece on this same piano on an evening 30 years ago, when he'd finally understood that the stubborn, impossible woman he'd married was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He hadn't told her often enough. He hoped his son was smarter. From the sound of things, the music uninterrupted the long, unbroken quiet of two people sharing a room without needing to fill it. He was beginning to think Cole might be. He didn't say it that night. Cole sat beside Eleanor on that piano bench, with his arm behind her, and the music filling the room, and everything inside him leaning toward those three words like a man leaning into wind, and he didn't say them. Not because he didn't mean them. Because he'd spent 34 years learning that the things that mattered most were the ones you got exactly right, and he wasn't going to hand Eleanor Voss the most important words of his life in a moment that felt like it snuck up on him. She deserved better than a man ambushed by his own feelings. So he sat with it. He carried it through the next morning and the one after that, and he went about his work the way he always had, except that now there was a difference he couldn't have articulated to another person, a warmth in the center of things that hadn't been there before, like a fire. Someone had finally gotten lit in a room that had been cold a long time. He watched Eleanor, the way you watch something you're afraid to look away from in case it changes. She brought George his breakfast and argued gently with him about whether he was well enough to sit on the porch, and she lost, and George sat on the porch looking pleased with himself. She spent an hour in the garden talking to Danny about the soil, and Danny came back to the barn looking like someone had taken him seriously for the first time in his life. She fixed a loose hinge on the kitchen door that had been bothering Cole for 6 months. Without saying a word about it, just fixed it because she'd noticed it needed fixing. She was everywhere in the best possible way and took up almost no space in the worst possible way, meaning she still moved through her own life with a kind of careful smallness, like she hadn't quite shaken the habit of trying not to be too much. That was the part Cole was going to have to work on. He just had to figure out how. Bernard Voss came on a Wednesday. Cole saw the buggy coming up the road from the barn and went inside to find Eleanor so she'd have a minute to prepare herself. She was in the kitchen. She looked at him when he came in and said, "He's here. He's here." She put down what she was doing. She straightened her back that particular way she had of collecting herself, pulling her composure around her like something she'd learned to rely on, and said, "All right. You don't have to let him in if you're not ready." "I'll never be fully ready," she said. "That's not a reason to put it off." Cole stepped aside. She went to the door. Bernard Voss walked in without his usual authority. Cole had never seen the man look uncertain before. He looked uncertain now, stood in the hallway of the Harrod house, turning his hat in his hands, which was a gesture Cole recognized because he did it himself. "Eleanor," Bernard said. "Papa," she said. Her voice was steady. That was the bravery of it, that she could be this wounded and still stand this straight. "I need to tell you some things," Bernard said. "I know. Can we—" He gestured vaguely. "Sit somewhere." Eleanor looked at Cole briefly. He nodded once and went to check on his father, which was his way of giving them the room, and both of them knew it. He sat with George for 40 minutes. His father was in good spirits, sharper today than he'd been in weeks, and he wanted to talk about the North Pasture fencing project Cole had been planning for spring. They talked about fencing, and then about cattle grades, and then, because George could never stay away from it long, about Eleanor. "She read to me this morning," George said, "before you were up. Just sat in that chair and read aloud for an hour. Didn't ask if I wanted her to, just did it." "What did she read?" "Something about a sea captain." George waved his hand. "I didn't follow all of it, but I liked the sound of it." Cole looked at his father, at the lines in his face that were the lines of a hard life honestly lived, at the hands on the quilt that had built fences and broken ground and made this land what it was. "Dad," Cole said, "I love her." George looked at him without a flicker of surprise. "I know," he said. "I haven't told her yet." "I know that too." George settled back against his pillows. "What are you waiting for? I want to do it right." George studied him. "Cole, son, you want some advice from a man who waited too long too many times in his life." "No," Cole said. "There's no right moment," George said anyway. "There's just the moment you decide to stop waiting. That's the only one that counts." Cole looked at the wall for a moment, then he stood up. "I need to check on something downstairs," he said. George's eyes were already closing. "I know," he said for the third time, and smiled. The hallway was quiet when Cole came out. He stood at the top of the stairs and listened. No voices from the sitting room, which meant the conversation was over. He came down slowly and found Eleanor in the kitchen alone, standing at the window. Her back was to him. Her shoulders were doing something complicated, not shaking, not collapsed, just held in that way that meant she was working very hard to keep them level. "Eleanor." She turned around. Her eyes were dry. She'd been crying recently and stopped, which took more effort than not crying at all, and her face had the particular composed after-pain look that he'd come to understand was what Eleanor looked like when she was at the edge of what she could carry. "He told you everything?" Cole asked. "Yes." "All of it?" "All of it." She pulled in a breath. The clause he knew about, the timeline, how long he'd been planning it, the North Pasture. She pressed her mouth together briefly. "He also told me he said he'd been trying to find me a husband since I was 23, and every time he'd tried he'd chosen wrong. Chosen men who saw my family's money or my family's land and not me. And he'd watched it happen over and over, and when I came to him and said I wanted you." Her voice caught very slightly. "He said it was the first time I'd ever asked for something for myself, and he was so relieved that I wanted something that he built a whole scheme around protecting it before it could fall apart." "He was wrong to do that," Cole said. "He was wrong to do that." She agreed. "I told him so." She looked at her hands. "He cried." Cole blinked. "Bernard Voss cried." "He did." She looked up. "I've never seen him cry before, not even when my mother died." Her voice was unsteady now. "He said she would have done it differently. That she would have just told me the truth and trusted me to handle it. And he said he'd spent 30 years trying to protect me, the way he'd failed to protect her, and—" She stopped. "And that he was sorry." The kitchen was very quiet. "What did you say?" Cole asked. "I said I needed time." She pressed a hand flat on the counter. "And that I loved him. And that he needed to learn the difference between protecting someone and controlling them." She looked at Cole directly. "He's going to try. I think he means it." "I think he does too," Cole said. She nodded. She was gathering herself, pulling the composure back into place, and he watched her do it the way he'd watched her do it a dozen times now. That private, practiced act of collecting herself, and something in him finally broke open. "Eleanor," he said. "Stop." She looked at him surprised. "Stop what?" "Holding yourself together for my benefit." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stood in front of her. "You've been doing it since the day I met you. Making yourself smaller. Keeping everything locked up. You don't have to do that in this house." He looked at her steadily. "Not with me." Her throat moved. "Whatever you're feeling right now," he said, "you don't have to manage it into something presentable. Just feel it." Something cracked open in her face, just for a second, just a fracture in the composure, and then she pressed her lips together hard and looked at the ceiling. And when she looked back at him, her eyes were bright and full, and she said, "I really am very angry at my father. I know. And I'm sad. And I'm relieved. And I'm—" She stopped. "And," he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm grateful," she said, "that it ended up being you." Cole looked at her. This woman who'd asked for a fair chance and gotten a mess, who'd walked through every part of it without flinching, who'd won over his father, and his ranch hands, and his cold kitchen, and his late nights, and somewhere in the process without strategy or scheme, without a single word that was anything other than exactly true, had won him completely. "I love you," he said. It came out clean and simple, the way true things do when you stop trying to arrange them. Eleanor went absolutely still. "I know it's been 6 weeks," he said. "I know this started in a courthouse. I know none of this is how it was supposed to go. But I need you to know I love you. Not because of the ranch. Not because of your father's money, or the deal, or the mortgage. You." He held her gaze. "I love you because you are the most honest, most steady, most remarkable person I have ever met, and I don't want you to spend one more day moving through this house like you're trying not to take up too much space." Eleanor put her hand over her mouth, just for a second. Then she lowered it. "Cole Harrett," she said, and her voice was rough at the edges. "You are the most infuriating man I have ever—" She stopped. She breathed. "6 weeks ago, you slammed a paper on a table and called this a death sentence." I was wrong. You were very wrong. I know. She looked at him. Her eyes were wet now, and she wasn't hiding it. I have loved you, she said carefully, since the moment you sat in that armchair in the dark and asked me to play something else. Do you know how long I waited for someone to want to hear more of me instead of less? Cole reached out and took her hand. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and for a woman who never rushed anything, she closed the remaining distance between them with a certainty that told him she'd been ready for this exact moment for a long time. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the courthouse. It was the real thing, the true thing. The kind that neither of them was going to recover from, and both of them knew it, and neither of them minded at all. What came after was not without difficulty, because real life is not without difficulty, and Cole and Eleanor Harriet were real people, in a real county, in a real world that didn't stop needing things from them just because they'd found each other. Bernard Voss came back the following Sunday and sat at their kitchen table and ate the meal Eleanor put in front of him and said almost nothing for the first hour, and then said quite a lot in the second hour and left looking lighter than he had in years. It wasn't fixed. Fathers and daughters who've been through something like that don't fix it in one Sunday. But it was started. The door was open. Eleanor had held it open, which was generous, and Cole had made the coffee, which was the most he could offer, and between the two of them it was enough. Pete Alderman's formal complaint went nowhere, as Cole's lawyer had predicted it would. The legal challenge dissolved when the Amarillo firm confirmed that George Harriet's grandfather's deed rider held under examination. The ranch was unambiguously, permanently, and legally the Harriets. Cole sent a brief letter to Alderman informing him of this and did not editorialize. He didn't need to. Ruth Caldwell stopped Cole after church in early December. Eleanor had started attending, which had sent a low current of electricity through the pews on the first Sunday, and said stiffly but genuinely that Mrs. Harriet had been very kind to her sister during a difficult spell last week. Cole thanked her. That was the end of that. Tommy Briggs crossed the street when he saw Cole coming, which satisfied Cole more than any direct confrontation would have. George Harriet got out of bed for good on a cold Thursday in December. He was slower than he'd been, and Doc Haley had a list of things he wasn't supposed to do that he was going to ignore selectively. But he was up and dressed and at the kitchen table when Cole came downstairs, eating the breakfast Eleanor had made with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd been in bed too long. She put sage in the eggs, George told Cole. I know, she does that. Your mother used to do that. Cole poured his coffee and sat down. George looked between them. Eleanor at the stove. Cole at the table, the easy, unremarkable intimacy of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms, and his eyes went soft. Good, he said simply. Just that. Cole and Eleanor exchanged a brief look across the kitchen. Eleanor's mouth curved. The twist that Cole had never expected, the one that arrived on a gray January morning and sat him down harder than anything that had come before. It came in a letter from Eleanor's doctor in Amarillo. She'd gone for a routine visit 2 weeks earlier, the kind she'd told him was just a checkup, the kind he hadn't asked about, because he was still learning that asking about certain things was not interfering, it was caring, and he hadn't fully learned the difference yet. He found her sitting at the kitchen table with the letter open in front of her, and the look on her face was the one he'd learned to read by now. Not the composed public face, not the carefully managed face, but the real one, the one that only appeared when something had reached the part of her she usually kept guarded. Eleanor. She looked up. Sit down, she said. He sat. The doctor thinks... She stopped, started again. There may be a possibility. Her voice was doing something careful. That we might. She put the letter flat on the table and looked at him directly. She thinks I may be expecting. The kitchen went so quiet, Cole could hear the clock. Thinks, he said. She's not certain. She wants me to come back in 3 weeks to confirm. Eleanor watched his face with those steady eyes. Cole, say something. He looked at her. He looked at the letter. He looked back at her. 3 weeks is a long time to wait, he said. She stared at him. That's what I'm going to drive you back to Amarillo in 3 weeks, and sit in that waiting room for however long it takes, he said, and whatever that doctor tells us, we're going to hear it together. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. That's what I have to say. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned her hand over and gripped his. I was afraid you'd... She stopped. What? That it would be too much. Too fast. Eleanor, he squeezed her hand. Look at me. She did. 3 weeks ago, I didn't know what sage and eggs tasted like, he said. Now I'd notice if it wasn't there. Things move at the speed they move. This is where we are. He held her gaze. I'm not going anywhere. She pressed her lips together hard. Then she said very quietly, I'm scared. Of which part? All of it. So am I, he said. That's fine. We're scared together. She laughed. Not the small, almost laugh, but a real one, surprised out of her warm, and a little unsteady at the edges. And it was the best sound he'd heard in his life, and he planned to spend a long time making it happen again, as often as possible. 3 weeks later, the doctor in Amarillo confirmed it. Cole sat in that waiting room exactly as he'd promised, hat in his hands, getting approximately nothing useful done with his thoughts for 2 hours. And when Eleanor came out of the doctor's office and looked at him across the room, he knew before she said a word. He stood up. She crossed the room to him and said, Yes. And then his arms were around her, and she let herself be held fully without the careful management, without the practiced composure, just held in the middle of a waiting room in Amarillo, with people walking past, and a clock on the wall, and the whole ordinary world going about its business, while something extraordinary quietly took root. Spring came to the Harrett Ranch the way it always did, slowly at first, then all at once, like it had been waiting for permission. Eleanor's garden came up strong. She'd built the soil bed the way Cole had suggested, worked it through the winter with compost and thyme, and when the first green came through in April, she crouched in the dirt and touched each seedling like she was counting them. Cole stood at the fence and watched her the way he'd watched her that first week, without understanding what he was seeing. He understood now. He understood that the woman kneeling in the dirt had spent 16 years being told in every way a small town knows how to tell a person that she was not enough. Too quiet. Too plain. Too old. Too much, or not enough, or both at the same time, the way people do when they've decided they don't like someone and don't much care about being consistent. She'd carried all of that without breaking. She'd carried it all the way to a courthouse on a November morning and stood beside a man who didn't want her and said her vows in a clear, steady voice. And then she'd gone home to his cold house and made coffee and fixed his door and played Chopin in the dark and waited, not desperately, not bitterly, just steadily, the way she did everything for him, to figure out what she already knew. That they were going to be all right. That they were going to be better than all right. She looked up and found him watching her, and she didn't look away, and neither did he. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Just looking. At what? My wife, he said. In my garden. On my land. He paused. Hours. Eleanor stood up and walked to the fence and looked at him across it close enough that he could see the faint trace of mud on her cheek and the way the spring light caught her eyes. Cole, she said. Yeah. I'm going to need you to move that fence line 6 inches north if the squash are going to have enough room. He laughed. Out loud fully the way he hadn't laughed in longer than he could remember. It startled the horses in the near pasture and brought Danny out of the barn to see what had happened. Eleanor watched him with the small curve of a smile that wasn't small at all, that was in fact enormous in everything it meant, and she reached across the fence and put her hand on his arm, the way you touch something you're grateful for. Thank you, she said. For what? For deciding to try, she said. Even when you didn't want to. He covered her hand with his. "Eleanor, I had no idea what I was deciding." "I know," she said. "That's what made it brave." He looked at her, at this woman who had walked into his life through the worst door imaginable and become the best thing in it, who had never once asked him to be other than what he was, who had played music in the dark and fixed a hinge and brought coffee to boys who needed someone to see them, and had loved him quietly and completely before he'd had the sense to deserve it. "Move your own fence," he said. She laughed, and the land breathed around them, and the spring came on. And inside the house, George Harrod sat on the porch, listening to his daughter-in-law's laugh carry across the yard, and he closed his eyes and thought that some things, when they finally came right, came more right than you'd ever dared to hope. Cole Harrod had ridden into this year a stubborn man with a death sentence in his hand, and ridden out of it with something he hadn't known he was looking for: a partner, a home, a life that had weight and warmth and meaning in every room of it. And Eleanor Voss, the woman, nobody wanted the town's old maid, the one they'd talked about and pitied and written off. Eleanor had won him. Not with grand gestures, not with schemes or beauty or desperation. She had won him the only way she'd ever done anything: with patience, with honesty, with the quiet, unshakable belief that she was worth the wait. She had been right. She had always been right. And Cole Harrod, who had slammed a marriage license on a table and called it a death sentence, would spend the rest of his life being grateful that he had been wrong.